Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Oh man, you know what was fun? The politics of COVID mandates and social controls. Wasn't that a hoot? One of my best friends on the planet, let's just say that many of my other friends and colleagues would say that he buys into some conspiracy theories, which is obviously not how he sees things. For example, he was at one time, and probably is still, a 9/11 truther, someone who believes that 9/11 was an inside job. And I have gathered that he believes a number of other things about the world that are, let's just say, very heterodox. But I'm not really sure because that's not the kind of thing he and I talk about. Our deep friendship is based on a mutual love of music, first of all, indie rock, but also older rock and roll and pop and country and blues and folk and jazz and world music and electronic stuff. You name it. And this dude has the best knowledge and taste in music of anyone I have ever met in my life. And I've known a lot of music lovers over the years. For this reason, me and my buddy will be friends forever, even though we don't agree about many facts and political issues. My buddy was utterly opposed to COVID mandates from the very beginning. He never, not once wore a mask. He was never vaxxed. I'm pretty sure he thinks vaccines are some kind of genetically modified freakery engineered for some kind of heinous social ends. Moreover, my friend can't even believe that mature adults who value what he sees as their God-given individual sovereignty would go along with COVID mandates. He just can't believe it. Meanwhile, during COVID, I was over here like a fucking choir boy. When Fauci said jab, I asked when and where. I masked as long as there were mandates. I'm all vaxxed and boosted. I'm like, can you stick a vax in me once a month? Vax me to the maxi. If you take my friend's response and my response to public health mandates and put them on a spectrum, and maybe we can even make the spectrum even bigger by including folks who think we should all still be masking in social situations, you have the makings for what we call a controversy. And it was controversial, wasn't it? Indeed, for a while, it was something that became increasingly controversial and partisan. Well, it turns out that social controls aimed at public health have been controversial for a long time. That's one of the many things you learn from our guest, David Barnes' new book, Lazaretto, How Philadelphia Used an Unpopular Quarantine Based on Disputed Science to Accommodate Immigrants and Prevent Epidemics. Barnes, who is an associate professor of the history and sociology of science at the University of Pennsylvania, tells us the story of the Lazaretto, a quarantine station downriver from Philadelphia from the late 18th century to the late 19th century. And in some sense, the story continues to this day because Barnes is involved with the historical preservation of the site. Along the way, through a series of fascinating and beautifully rendered stories and character sketches, Barnes shows us just how controversial and regularly unpopular quarantine was. And yet, he argues it was also effective. Now, as you'll hear, this was not some rip from the headlines book that was trying to cash in on COVID. Barnes has been working on this since the first decade of this century. History just contingently made Barnes' book very, very timely. Very, very timely and also just great. It's a gorgeously written book, and I'm glad I got the chance to read it. I had a lot of fun talking with David Barnes. You'll see. Hey, get excited! thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
You're welcome.
So Lazaretto is a really neat and timely book. It's also very prettily written, I think. If when you're explaining to strangers, what do you say it's about, and what were you trying to do with this book?
Quarantine was complicated. I'm trying to um, explore the layers of complication involved in the practice of quarantine in the 19th century and um, sketch out how deeply quarantine as an institution was embedded in the life of a port city
Mm-hmm.
throughout the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. And, yeah. And when did you start working on this book? I mean, with COVID and everything, it was like, it's a great topic, right? But when did you start as a historian working on this?
Yeah, well, COVID happened, and I thought, you know what? I'm just gonna whip up a book in a few months. No, I've been working on this book for um, 16 years now.
Okay.
Um, it's and it started with. I'm embarrassed to say I had never heard of the Lazaretto, this old quarantine station outside Philadelphia. Um, I'm a historian of public health. I had written at the time I found out about the Lazaretto. I had already published two books on the history of 19th century public health,
Yeah.
and I should know these things. But when I arrived in Philadelphia, I did not know about the Lazaretto, and I was in a meeting with some colleagues planning a sort of inter-university consortium course on the history of public health in Philadelphia, and one colleague mentioned the Lazaretto. She said we could have students visit the Lazaretto, and I thought, what is that? Where is that? And it kind of intrigued me. And the next time I was in the neighborhood, I stopped by the site of this old quarantine station. This was like January 2006. It was a
Hmm.
completely different world. And my scholarly thoughts were elsewhere,
Mm-hmm.
otherwise occupied at the time. But the site of this place, this grand, stately, but decaying old building right by the edge of the river in this weirdly bucolic setting,
Hmm.
um, surrounded by like the airport on one side, the busy Interstate 95 on the other side, industrial sites, the just complete incongruity of the site just grabbed hold of me. And I wondered, I couldn't stop thinking, what happened here? This place was obviously a big deal
Mm-hmm.
in its day. What happened here? Why so stately? Why this spot? And those questions just wouldn't let go of me. And so I scrapped my other research plans and started seriously researching this project in 2007. And it's been a long haul. I got involved in the actual preservation of the historic site itself, and it's taken me down many paths. This project has introduced me to the field of public history, to the field of historic preservation, to all kinds of things that I never,
That's cool, man.
learned about in graduate school.
Yeah.
But it's been a real eye opener.
That's so cool. And so, I mean, your book is. I mean, we'll get into the guts of it a bit here, but like it's made up of a number of really fascinating case studies of like little stories that are really rich and full of detail. What kind of historical work did you do to find this stuff out? Where were you finding these stories?
Well, for a long time, all I had were stories,
Mm-hmm.
and I had no kind of scholarly architecture or interpretation or lessons to learn.
Mm.
But if you once I started digging, I found stories everywhere. I had the sense that, there had to be stories behind this kind of ghostly hulk of a historic site. And sure enough, in the archives, a lot of my research is built on um, the archives of the Philadelphia Board of Health,
Mm-hmm.
which ran the Lazaretto quarantine station during its years of operation, and almost all of the minutes of the Board of Health's daily meetings have
Wow.
survived. Not all, but almost all. That's a gold mine. And there are little tidbits hidden in archival collections here and there. But newspapers,
Yeah.
19th century newspapers, are another gold mine.
Mm-hmm.
And quarantine was just built into the fabric of commerce and
Yeah.
everyday life. And so stories related to quarantine, stories coming from quarantine, um, kind of revealed themselves in all over the place.
Yeah. One of the things you hope to counter in your book is our arrogance about medicine before germ theory and antibiotics. So you write, this is a story of how quarantine worked. And I wondered, could you say a bit about, like how what you mean by our arrogance, and also, walk out this idea that quarantine worked for me a bit.
Yeah, my bête noire in this business is this widespread assumption that medicine before bacteriology and antibiotics was nothing but barbaric,
Yeah.
superstitious nonsense at best,
Yeah.
nonsense at best, and actual butchery at worst.
Mm-hmm.
And and honestly, it drives me
Yeah.
nuts. It's there's a line from a really fascinating book by Stephen Johnson, who is a kind of journalist, science
Yeah.
journalist who writes about historical topics occasionally. Has a fascinating book on John Snow and the cholera epidemic of 1854. It's called The Ghost Map, and Johnson writes. He has a pithy sentence somewhere in that book where he says, "How could so many smart people have been so grievously wrong for so long?"
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the wrong question. It is absolutely the wrong
Yeah.
question. Um, the question I'm interested in is, um, in what ways were they right? How were they right? What
Yeah.
constituted right to them? So um, I try to avoid dropping the E-bomb on my students' epistemology,
Yeah.
uh, because it's just the
The
it's a
theory of knowledge.
philosophical term
Yeah.
that makes people's brains freeze when they hear it. But uh, how what counts as true in different circumstances in different historical
Mm.
eras and is absolutely fascinating and incredibly important. And medicine and public health before bacteriology, before uh, advanced biomedical technology, was rich, complicated, empirical, um, results oriented, and effective if you judge effectiveness by the standards of the time.
Yeah.
And so the my big sort of scholarly agenda, I guess, in my whole career has been um, to sort of reconstruct the very rich and lively science and practice of public health
Mm.
before bacteriology, and to show that along with everything we've gained from bacteriology and the advances that have flowed from it um, over the last century and a half
Mm-hmm.
almost, we've lost something really important from the public health knowledge that flourished before germ theory.
Hmm.
And recovering that lost knowledge, I think, is has a potential to open up new possibilities in public health knowledge and policy today.
Mm-hmm. Can you just briefly say a bit more about what you think we've lost?
Yeah, we've in gaining the knowledge that the problem of illness and disease in general,
Mm-hmm.
is actually um, constituted by individual disease entities, each of which has its own nature and its own cause,
Yeah.
singular cause, microbial cause, um, we've lost this idea that disease is the product of certain kinds of physical environments and
Hmm.
social arrangements, and particularly the idea that is, you know, um, borne out in every investigation ever done historically that the number one cause of disease is poverty
Yeah.
and various kinds of disenfranchisement and lack of access to certain basic
Hmm.
resources. And my my favorite sort of aphorism about what we've lost in public health comes from our colleague Chris Hamlin, um, who's now emeritus at Notre Dame. And Chris wrote a brilliant book on public health in Britain in the Age of Chadwick, Public Health and Social Justice, it's called. And Chris says, let me see if I can remember the exact wording. Um, when the um, when the factors that um, support and sustain health are for the most part known, the map of the availability of those factors is the map of rights that exist in that society.
Hmm.
Um, it's just about the most profound thing that's ever been written, I think,
Huh.
about public health.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Um, so I think our collective reaction to COVID demonstrated, if nothing else, that we're not used to reacting to epidemics. I remember having to. My son was 4 at the time, and I remember having to explain to him that, you know, my wife and I had never had to do these things before in our lifetime, right?
Hmm.
But as a historian, how do you give people a sense of what it was like to live, in a very different period where there was like wave after wave of epidemics? So, for instance, you teach a class on epidemic history, right? So,
I
yeah,
do. I
how do you
do.
try to give people a feel for that?
Yeah. Well, the best way is to give people a taste of what people said and wrote and felt about health and disease um, in a time when epidemics were familiar
Mm-hmm.
and all too commonplace. Um, and it's not that I think it's sort of logical to assume that people accepted deadly epidemics as part of life. I don't think that's quite accurate.
Yeah.
I think the impression that I get from reading the primary sources from the late 18th century and the first part of the 19th century is that people never accepted
Mm.
epidemics and they never fully became accustomed to them. Um, they did become accustomed to the dread of impending epidemics,
Mm-hmm.
and they were desperate um, to kind of allay that dread by preparing, by building an infrastructure, by by prayer, by policies, by uh, you know by flight.
Yeah.
Simply
Exactly.
the most common response to epidemics among people who had the means to go anywhere else was simply to flee.
Mm-hmm.
And um, for better or for worse, that was actually the best way to avoid yellow fever, which is the epidemic that is responsible for the Lazaretto's creation.
Mm-hmm. Um, I wondered, just as a kind of writerly decision, you have a couple of these boxes that lay out the diseases and what they are. There's one on yellow fever, and I think the other is on typhus. There might be one or two more in the book.
Yeah.
I just wondered what led you to that. I thought they were very helpful as a reader, but what led you there?
Um, I'm always trying to put myself in my reader's head. Um, what is the reader expecting? What is the reader wanting? How can I um, manipulate the reader's expectations and subvert them and surprise them. And but the one thing I never want to be is confusing, inaccessible,
Mm-hmm.
or difficult.
Uh-huh.
Um, I want to be challenging, but I don't want to be
Yeah.
difficult. And it's just I've just learned from speaking to audiences, from showing my work to all kinds of people, fellow scholars and students and people who are not in the scholarly world at all. Um, uh, they always, always, always want to know what really causes yellow fever.
Uh-huh.
How is it really spread? What is typhus?
Mm-hmm.
And what does it look like? What does it feel like? Um, and I accept that as much as I want people to project themselves back to a time where we didn't know any of those things. We knew lots of other things
Yeah.
about yellow fever and about typhus. Um, and we use different vocabulary to refer to them. It's still just annoying.
Yeah.
It's just frankly annoying for readers to go through this kind of narrative and this interpretation without having those basic questions answered.
Yeah.
So I want to say, look, uh, I'm going to ask you to forget this in a minute,
Yeah.
but here's what we think we know about these diseases today.
Yeah. And you do. I think you do a great job of spelling out, how they thought and tried to identify these diseases at the time. And the one that really, I think on top of this book is many different kinds of histories. I think. I mean, it's a history of public health, but there's a lot more going on here. And one of them, I mean, I thought you did a great job as like a sensory historian. And
Hmm.
and I think this is something you've done before, including in an earlier book, right? Like writing about smells as like the
Yeah.
thing. So I mean, tell us a bit about disease and smells during this period and how they thought about smell as like a diagnosing tool and such.
Yeah. I have been interested in the senses and particularly in smell for a while, and that interest was piqued in my second book, where foul odors played an important role in the development of um, public health in late 19th century France. But uh, that exercise kind of attuned me to um, the extent to which our experience of the world and everyone's experience of the world at all times
Yeah.
is shaped by the sensorium, by the sensory landscapes in which we live and work and play.
Yeah.
Uh, so, so in this book, I thought I want readers to, you know, disease is not an intellectual
Yeah.
exercise.
Yeah.
It's not an abstract experience. It's a bleeping physical
Yeah.
experience, and it's not pleasant. And I don't want to. I think there were times when I was writing drafts of different chapters where uh, some of my friends and people who had read drafts thought I was going a little bit too far in evoking, for example, the smell of the cargo hold
Mm-hmm.
of immigrant vessels in the 19th century, just packed like sardine cans with desperately poor and starving immigrants who, were just excreting and vomiting everywhere.
Yeah.
And um, I want, I don't want to rub readers' noses or any other parts of their bodies in these incredibly unpleasant environments, but I do want readers to confront
Mm.
and at least consider the experience of um, living in this world and of um, encountering these diseases, either in one's own body or in the body of loved ones or
Mm-hmm.
neighbors. Um, I just think that's part of I think that's part of good writing,
Yeah.
is to sort of bring your reader into the world, whether it's fiction or nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's for me, it's part of good history, just to sort of think about what it might have felt like to be in that world.
Yeah. So, can you set the scene for us with the wave of yellow fever that struck Philadelphia in the 1790s? I mean, what was it like to live there at the time during this period? I mean, I have a number of questions for you about that
Sure.
decade, but set it up for us.
Yeah, in the 1790s, Philadelphia was the nation's capital. The nation was quite young, of course. And it was the nation's largest city and busiest seaport. It was, I don't know if you've seen the musical Hamilton, but there's this, romanticization of New York in the
Hmm.
1770s as the greatest city in the world, quote unquote. And I'm sorry, Lin-Manuel Miranda, you are undoubtedly a genius, but the greatest city in the world? No, absolutely not. New York was a backwater in before 1800, and Philadelphia was where it's at, and Philadelphia was a backwater compared to the great capitals of
Sure.
Europe or China
Yeah.
or the Middle East. But Philadelphia was where it's at in terms of it's as far as the United States was concerned, in as a place of learning, as a place of it was the medical capital of the United States. Um, so even just as the nation's capital alone, it was a big deal when yellow fever struck in 1793 and uh, killed 5,000 people out of a population of 50,000
Yeah.
in the space of a little over 2 months.
Yeah.
Just imagine that today, 10% of the population dropping dead in 2 months.
Yeah.
Terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And, um, you know, it obviously disrupted the national government. Of course, the national government really wasn't much to speak of
Yeah.
in the 1790s. Uh, but it was a huge crisis, and the fact that it came back three more times later in that same decade, almost as severely as it had in 1793, with just thousands upon thousands of deaths. Um, it was um, it was absolutely horrifying to contemplate, and it was starting to seem like the new normal. Like this was something that was going to be a regular feature
Yeah.
of life in Philadelphia. And it made some people, including Thomas Jefferson himself, um, wonder whether um, any large city in this landscape, in this part of the
Hmm.
world, was sustainable, was habitable. And Jefferson actually wrote to several friends of his desire that the consequence of yellow fever would be to depopulate all cities. And he was not a fan of cities, as
Right.
we know.
Yeah.
But that was a real possibility in many people's minds
Wow.
that Philadelphia would essentially cease to exist, and possibly all cities above a certain size would cease to exist after this kind of devastation.
Hmm.
So it's in response to that, not just one epidemic, but this rapid fire succession of devastating epidemics that you know Philadelphia's leaders and the nation's leaders realized something's got to change. We've got to do something differently, and that resulted in, among other things, the establishment of a new state-of-the-art quarantine station farther from the city than the old quarantine station, which clearly wasn't
Hmm.
working. Um, and the hope, at least the desperate, defiant hope that these deadly epidemics could be kept at bay.
Hmm. Can we talk about? So I want to turn to the foundation of the new Lazaretto, the new quarantine station, in a second. But before we get there, can you give us a sense of like how did doctors and leaders of the city respond to at first? And also, I mean, it sounds like governing epidemics during this period was very difficult for all kinds of reasons, including like you say that there were quarantine rules, but they're being flouted left and right. There's really no policing of it. So can you say
Hmm.
both like, what did they try and what were kind of barriers to success for them early on?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything about these yellow fever epidemics was extremely problematic and beyond the capability of anyone to comprehend, much less like control.
Hmm.
So, quarantine was in some ways the least of it. The quarantine operation, as you said, was poorly enforced. It was very leaky, um, and obviously didn't stop these terrible epidemics in the 1790s. But just providing care for so many sick people
Hmm.
was um, was beyond the capability of any institution or individual, even all doctors, all medical practitioners in Philadelphia couldn't possibly handle even a fraction of the um, number of people who were sick every day. So, um, kind of ragtag band of volunteers, sort of civic leaders and merchants, and led by the mayor of Philadelphia, Matthew Clarkson, um, organized themselves in an emergency committee to just meet the basic needs of the people
Hmm.
and to organize relief drives so that anyone who had any supplies or money to contribute would to help provide shelter for people who were homeless and food for people who had nothing, and basic medical care, if nothing, like a bed or something resembling a
Yeah.
bed um, for the sick people. And it was a challenge just to get people to transport the sick
Yeah.
and to bury the dead, much less provide nursing care
Hmm.
for patients. And it was in 1793, based on the erroneous belief that people of African descent were immune to yellow fever, that Benjamin Rush, the uh, most prominent doctor in Philadelphia and founding father, illustrious citizen, um, pleaded with the leaders of the Free African Society, essentially the free black community of Philadelphia, to organize the black community
Hmm.
to to transport the sick, to provide nursing care, and help bury the dead. Um, and in the similarly erroneous belief that doing so would help improve the condition of black people and would perhaps dispel uh, dispel some of the myths and racist beliefs about them. The Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, the leaders of the Free African Society, did organize the black community, and essentially the thanks they got were accusations of profiteering,
Hmm.
um, and some people, Rush and other leaders, were in fact quite grateful, and Rush himself acknowledged that he was wrong to believe that black people were immune because black people did get sick and did die of yellow fever. Um, so anyway, just meeting those basic needs was
Hmm.
beyond the capacity of the city, and it was in some ways, a minor miracle that enough volunteers stepped forward to meet even, a fraction
Yeah.
of those needs. And unfortunately, that became um, a habit later in the 1790s as yellow fever returned.
Hmm. Yeah. So, what was a lazaretto, and where did the term come from?
Lazaretto is an Italian term that referred to either an isolation hospital for patients with contagious diseases or a facility for quarantining ships or other vessels. And often it referred to both,
Hmm.
a quarantine station that included an isolation hospital. Um, and the name comes from the biblical figure Lazarus,
Okay.
a beggar covered with sores who became the patron saint of lepers,
Hmm.
and so and the diminutive form of his name became the word Lazaretto, which was used to designate the first quarantine stations and isolation hospitals in the in Venice Harbor in the 15th century when plague was a recurring threat
Mm-hmm.
in particularly in busy Mediterranean commercial seaports like Venice, with who traded frequently with um, you know Middle Eastern ports,
Mm-hmm.
and plague generally traveled from Central Asia through the Middle East to the Mediterranean and parts of Europe and North Africa.
Mm-hmm. And is this just one of these words that would have been much better known in earlier times and just kind of a slip from or was it more specialized
Yeah,
even during that period? Yeah.
what a fascinating question, and I can't fully answer that.
Yeah.
The yes, it was. I think educated people um, knew of the Lazaretto as something that one encountered when one traveled through the
Uh-huh.
Mediterranean, and they knew something about the history of plague
Mm-hmm.
epidemics that spawned the Mediterranean lazarettos. But in the United States, um, there were, you know, almost every major seaport had some kind of quarantine facility at some point in the 19th century. Um, Three of them that I'm aware of, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Savannah, Georgia,
Hmm.
called their quarantine stations lazarettos.
Okay.
New York, Boston, Norfolk, Charleston
Huh.
did not use the term lazaretto.
Okay.
Why? I have no idea.
Yeah.
I I suspect it may be a kind of posturing of like
Yeah.
civilized, like continental savoir-faire,
Yeah.
but I really that's just complete conjecture.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, so as you kind of spelled out earlier, this new Lazaretto is set up in 1801 in response to these yellow fever epidemics. I mean, what did it take to set it up, and what were the early experiences there? Was it seen as an immediate success, or yeah, tell us a bit about that.
Everyone kind of held their breath and hoped. I just have this image of like thousands of Philadelphians looking down river and crossing their fingers,
Yeah, yeah.
and and their toes, like please, please let this work. Um, so it was quite expensive. It was, a very large facility. There's an interesting newspaper kind of press release that appeared in the Philadelphia papers when the Board of Health first purchased the property and decided to build the Lazaretto there. They say um, something about expedition, utility, economy, and beauty will meet each other in this public facility, which is kind of bureaucraties for um, we're going to do this quickly. We're not going to waste your money. Um, it will work, and it'll be something you can be proud of.
Mm-hmm.
So it was meant to be stately, to project a kind of sense of confidence and control.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Viewed from the river, the whole sort of campus was symmetrical, and the sort of architectural antecedents are kind of like
Mm.
English country estates
Uh-huh.
in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there was nothing like it in North America at the time.
Huh.
It was really one of a kind. It was state of the art, and right off the bat, the very first entry in the first volume of Board of Health minutes that survives from 1801. The first entry is about a ship arriving from Liverpool. The ship was called the Venture Again, and it basically um, half of its passengers had died on the
Oh,
voyage
God.
of typhus, and the other half, every single one who survived, was desperately ill upon arrival at the Lazaretto, including the crew, except for the first mate, only the only healthy person on board this
Jesus.
terrible ship. And And that was what it was like from day one at the Lazaretto. It's kind of
Wow.
for many years it was sort of feast or famine. There'd be no activity, or
Yeah.
every ship that was inspected would be cleared to proceed to the city, and then all of a sudden a ship would arrive with 50, 60, 100 seriously ill uh, passengers aboard, and they needed to be taken care of and fed and clothed and
Yeah.
and furnished with beds and bedding um, right away. And it was just crisis after crisis, punctuated by long periods of inactivity and boredom.
Yeah. So the part two of your book is called "Managing the New Normal," and is this the new normal that you're describing?
Um, the new normal, yeah, by new normal, I mean the process by which quarantine gradually became uh, accepted as part of uh, city life, as part of the cost of doing business. Literally,
Mm-hmm.
included dealing with the hassle of quarantine, inspection, occasionally detention. Um, Nobody ever liked quarantine.
Yeah.
Everybody resented it or just outright hated it. It was inconvenient. The delay alone was inconvenient
Yep.
for merchants. It was an unwanted extra cost. Merchandise could
Yep.
spoil, um, and
It's a real threat to
uh,
capitalism, right? Shutting
yeah,
down is a real shut. Yeah.
it's exactly. It's at best slowing, if not actually obstructing the flow of
Yeah.
goods, which is essential to capitalism. And um, so so everybody was always complaining about it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's remarkable that quarantine survived for so long. And I think the biggest reason is there's only one thing uh, that's worse for business than quarantine, and that's an
Yeah.
epidemic.
Right.
Epidemics are really, really bad for
Right.
business,
Right.
and I think everyone understood that
Yeah.
on some level. There were very vitriolic debates among doctors, especially about what caused yellow fever and whether quarantine was an appropriate response.
Yeah.
Uh, there were those who were really honestly in the minority who believed that yellow fever was contagious, was spread from person to person, and it originated in the West Indies in tropical climates and was brought to places like Philadelphia aboard these ships. And there were others like Benjamin Rush who were really in the majority, who believed that yellow fever was not contagious. It wasn't coming from the West Indies. It originated locally in accumulations of filth,
Mm-hmm.
um, and under certain meteorological conditions, that accumulations of filth could give off disease-causing emanations or miasmas.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and people like Rush thought quarantine was a complete waste of time and money and resources. Um, and yet, even when um, no respectable doctors believed in contagion anymore, believed that yellow fever and plague and other diseases, epidemic diseases, were actually spread from person to person.
Hmm.
Um, Even when no doctors believed in contagion any longer, quarantine still survived because quarantine was actually not based on a belief in contagion. And this is part of my argument in the book. I explain how um, it was believed that under certain circumstances, a certain kind of contamination in the air could be transported over long distances, particularly in the enclosed cargo holds of seagoing vessels um, in hot weather, and that this contaminated air brought from places where yellow fever was more or less endemic or much more common could then cause epidemics when they arrived in Philadelphia, whether the disease was spread from person to person or not.
Mm-hmm.
So it was that, it's a strange situation where the doctors in public were kind of staking their reputations on their position regarding whether yellow fever was contagious or not, when in fact that was irrelevant
Uh-huh.
to the actual practice of quarantine.
Mm-hmm.
And at the Lazaretto, the Lazaretto physician, the quarantine master, and the Board of Health were often much more concerned with the state of arriving cargo
Uh-huh.
than they were with the health of passengers and
Hmm.
sailors.
At one point, you talk about social efficacy, and you say that managing disease was not enough. You also needed to do all this kind of social work in the sense of reassuring people and doing like calming them down. I just feel like it sounds like and it's politically contested. So talk about that side of the work. I mean, you're
Yeah.
not just dealing with quarantining people and like healing them. There's a lot more to be done.
Yeah. And so I argue that quarantine worked in two respects. I mean, based on everything we know today about how yellow fever spreads, there is a way in which the aggressive quarantine, or at least occasionally aggressive quarantine, as practiced at the Lazaretto, probably um, reduced the chances for all the different kind of ecological, all the elements that constitute the ecology that allows yellow fever to spread epidemically, um, reduce the number of opportunities for those elements to all be in the same place at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. But I also argue that quarantine worked in the sense of social efficacy, which is a term borrowed from medical anthropologists. Um, and it means that efficacy is not only um, measured by the kind of uh, biomedical effect of a drug or a
Yep.
policy in actually preventing um, pathogens from infecting humans, um, but also um, in the sense of public health. Social efficacy means um, taking concerted, visible public action
Mm.
to express the collective resolve of a population to fight back, to resist, and to prevent recurrence of these epidemics. It's a it's a product of the trauma, the lasting trauma inflicted on the psyche of the population by these devastating epidemics, that something had to be done. It had to be big, it had to be visible,
Mm-hmm.
and it had to be ongoing. Um, so even if quarantine did nothing to actually, uh, of course, quarantine didn't prevent mosquitoes
Yeah.
from arriving in Philadelphia, but yeah. So I argue there was this sort of probably an ecological effect of quarantine in minimizing epidemics. But even if it didn't, the fact that the city was expressing its collective determination to survive and to thrive and to grow in the face of this threat was critical to the survival of quarantine as an institution.
Yeah, that's really good. Um, you have, I mean, people just need to read your book. There's a lot of the chapters are these just wonderfully rich case studies. Sadly, but probably not surprisingly, a lot of these ideas and attempts to control disease are caught up in other terrible ideas about race and poverty and immigrants and these other categories of marginalized and oppressed folks. But you have this really interesting chapter on Tobias Smith, a so-called mischievous boy. So,
Hmm.
just to give like listeners an example, like, what were you able to draw out of Smith's story to kind of tell something larger for your book?
Yeah, what a crazy story. So so um, the new Lazaretto did sort of succeed in preventing outbreaks. The frequency and severity of yellow fever outbreaks diminished
Hmm.
drastically after the new Lazaretto was opened in 1801. Now, um, that's kind of post hoc
Sure.
ergo
Yeah.
propter hoc reasoning. It's there. there must have been many factors in addition to the Lazaretto that were responsible for that, and historians and epidemiologists still kind of aren't entirely sure why that happened. But there still were breakthrough outbreaks of yellow fever, including in 1805. And whenever that happened, obviously the Board of Health was under a microscope, and it was determined. Its whole purpose was to avoid these kind of catastrophes. And so when yellow fever did return, as it did in 1805, they had to, in addition to responding to it, they had to explain it. And what they did in 1805 was they found a convenient scapegoat. And that was this poor 11-year-old orphan boy named Tobias Smith. We don't know that much about his life, but was he was as a young child, he was in the Philadelphia almshouse, which almost certainly means he was orphaned. He was either orphaned or abandoned by his parents, and he ended up being indentured as a servant to this business owner in the Riverside neighborhood of Philadelphia, and he lived in a room above the shop and near the Catherine Street Wharf, I believe it was, and his fellow employee, Tobias was around 11 in 1805. His fellow employee was a 20-year-old named Peter Young. And somehow Tobias Smith and Peter Young ended up in a boat headed downriver towards the Lazaretto. And at that point, accounts diverge as to what happened. But according to the Board of Health, Peter Young and Tobias Smith were flagrantly violating quarantine regulations by coming into contact with ships that were undergoing quarantine at the Lazaretto. And it's possible that they boarded one or more of those ships. One account had it that Peter Young was visiting his brother, who was on one of those ships that was being detained in quarantine. Another account has it that the two boys were selling goods to the passengers who were undergoing quarantine. In any case, it was against the rules. Really, really not a smart idea. And as soon as they got back to town, a day or two later, both Peter Young and Tobias Smith got sick with the symptoms of yellow fever. And Peter Young died. Tobias Smith survived, but right in their neighborhood, yellow fever began to spread immediately after they fell ill, and then spread a little bit more widely in the city of Philadelphia. So after the fact, the Board of Health spent a lot of time and energy trying to reconstruct the events that ignited this outbreak, and they ended up pinning the blame on the one person who survived from these initial cases, Tobias Smith, and they interrogated him repeatedly. He reportedly changed his story a couple of times, denied going downriver, then admitted going downriver, but denied going to the Lazaretto. Didn't know what the Lazaretto was or where it was, and he was treated quite poorly by the Board of Health, who was really just desperate to explain away this outbreak and to insist that the board had all the right policies and mechanisms in place, but this one scofflaw, or these two scofflaws rather, had thwarted their quarantine and introduced the disease into the city. So it's kind of classic CYA mode for bureaucrats, and understandable, but just unfortunate that, well, Tobias Smith was fortunate enough to survive yellow fever, but the fact that he survived put him in the crosshairs of
Mm-hmm.
this Board of Health investigation.
No, it's a really interesting story. Um, so the third part of your book is called Crisis, Statesmanship, and in Decline, 1853 to 1895. And by 1853, the Lazaretto is well established. It's been there for over 50 years. So what leads this well established institution into crisis at that point?
Well, the Lazaretto is indeed well established. Quarantine is a still a resented but generally accepted part of urban life and commerce. Um, what happens in 1853 is there's another outbreak of yellow fever, certainly a small one by the standards of the 1790s,
Mm-hmm.
but after at that point 33 years of no yellow fever in Philadelphia, any, even just a few
Mm-hmm.
cases, is unacceptable and terrifying. So, uh, yeah, in 1853, it was it started with a ship from Cuba that had arrived at the Lazaretto. It was inspected there by the Lazaretto physician, Dr. Stokes, Thomas Jefferson Perkins Stokes. Um, and Stokes inspected the vessel, and the quarantine master, Matthew Van Dusen, inspected the cargo. Um, and they decided that it should be ventilated overnight. There was word that there had been illnesses and possibly a couple of deaths on the ship during the voyage from Cuba. Um, Stokes ordered a kind of cursory cleaning of the ship, and then the next day allowed it to proceed to the city.
Hmm.
Shortly after its arrival, cases of yellow fever appeared in the immediate vicinity of the wharf where it docked, and again, yellow fever spread. Familiar dynamic. Thankfully, it didn't spread to the entire city, and it didn't kill thousands. Um, but it was still scary,
Mm-hmm.
and um, and an explanation had to be found. And this time, the scapegoat was not some hapless 11-year-old orphan. It was Dr. Stokes,
Mm-hmm.
the Lazaretto physician and the quarantine master, the son and brother of uh, people who died of yellow fever during that outbreak, was actually a lawyer, which was not good news for Stokes. And once this lawyer found out that Stokes had allowed this ship to
Mm-hmm.
proceed after just less than 24 hours of detention, he was on the warpath, and he succeeded. He wrote to the newspapers saying, this gross dereliction of duty killed my father and my brother, um, and um, and Stokes and Van Dusen, the Lazaretto physician and quarantine master, were actually prosecuted
Hmm.
for negligence in allowing the ship to proceed. It was the only time that had ever happened in the history of the Lazaretto. In the end, they were both acquitted, but it didn't. The whole episode did not reflect well upon the institution of quarantine and, by extension, the Board of Health.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of years later, uh, a prominent member of the Philadelphia doctor, who was a member of the Board of Health, began to organize a network of public health officials in major ports, first major port cities in the United States, and then eventually um, all major cities, including some inland cities, uh, to meet annually to discuss quarantine and to discuss other um, pressing public health matters.
Mm-hmm.
And these national quarantine and sanitary conferences began in 1856 or 7. I think 1857.
Mm-hmm.
and in Philadelphia. And the idea among a lot of these doctors and public health officials was to agree upon a uniform system of quarantine everywhere, and ideally a uniform kind of set of best practices
Mm-hmm.
for public health that could be followed by all cities. And so many of the delegates at those conventions actually advocated abolishing quarantine entirely. That did not gain much support, but everyone agreed that quarantine was inefficient and um, unnecessarily
Mm-hmm.
burdensome and not as effective as it ought to be. So, so things weren't looking too great for the institution of quarantine in the late 1850s. It was only the outbreak of the Civil War that put an end to these annual conferences and to
Mm-hmm.
the uniform kind of public health code that they were in the process of developing. Parenthetically, um, some of the delegates later, about 15 years later, some of the key delegates from those quarantine conventions um, began to meet again and instituted the American Public Health Association,
Okay.
which became and is still today
Yeah.
the leading public health organization in the country.
You
Um,
had a great chapter later in the book about the role of kind of women's work in keeping this place going, and something that's hard to see sometimes as historians. So tell us a bit about the darkest hour of 1870.
yeah, yeah. Women are virtually absent from the records of the Lazaretto,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, women got yellow fever and typhus and died of those diseases and were, treated at the Lazaretto. But women worked at the Lazaretto as well. Um, their work was mostly invisible and underappreciated, if not entirely unappreciated. They worked especially as nurses.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And when now men worked as nurses as well, but the nurses, as far as I've been able to tell, the nurses were mostly women.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and as I said, there were times of acute crisis punctuated by long periods of inactivity and
Mm-hmm.
boredom. But in the times of crisis, it was absolutely urgent to provide basic accommodations and care and food and drink and beds to um, dozens or even hundreds of patients all of a sudden. So this work was critical. In fact, in one chapter, I examine the medical care, the kinds of treatment that were administered to
Mm-hmm.
patients at the Lazaretto, especially yellow fever and typhus patients. And I try to explain the surprisingly high rate of recovery of patients with those often fatal diseases at the Lazaretto. Yellow fever is still, considered incurable today, which
Mm-hmm.
only means that there's no single specific and widely effective treatment for yellow fever. Typhus certainly is treatable with antibiotics today, but uh, we did not have antibiotics
Right.
in the 19th century. So, in any case, one reason I argue why uh, almost 90% of patients treated at the Lazaretto Hospital recovered um, is boils down to essentially nursing care,
Mm-hmm.
um, providing food and drink, clean, warm clothing, clean bedding, place to sleep, rest,
Yep.
and
All of which
and
were things
attention
were
to
not
to
available to many people at that time, especially poor people,
absolutely,
right?
absolutely,
Yeah.
um, and even just providing a bed, would be a challenge when the Lazaretto was overwhelmed
Mm-hmm.
with patients. Um, so anyway, I call that the care cure,
Yeah.
and I question sort of our historians and just people in general's preoccupation with specific, especially pharmaceutical
Yeah.
and high tech forms of medical treatment in and occasionally neglecting the provision of just basic nursing care and
Yeah.
treating symptoms and
Taking care of
anyway
each other. Yeah. Yeah.
1870 is a time when this this came to the fore, and one of the few times when actually the work of women is made visible
Hmm.
at the Lazaretto. Um, a ship arrives from Jamaica in terrible condition. One old timer who worked at the Lazaretto said it was the filthiest vessel he had ever seen in his life. Um, and all of the crew um, were, except one, I believe, were sick with yellow fever when the ship arrived at the Lazaretto. Um, Unfortunately, the case was probably bungled by the Lazaretto physician, who paid for it with his life. Um, and yellow fever, I go into quite a lot of detail because this outbreak was documented more abundantly and more minutely than any
Hmm.
other, since it happened, you know, in the Board of Health's own quarantine station.
Mm-hmm.
For the first time, yellow fever spread widely among the Lazaretto staff
Hmm.
and among neighbors who lived nearby. Um, this had never happened before and was absolutely terrifying. It also spread to the city in one particular neighborhood, and the total number of deaths was just a couple of dozen or
Mm-hmm.
so at the Lazaretto and in the city. But still, that was Lazaretto spreading in within the institution itself, killing the Lazaretto physician, killing the quarantine master, killing the head nurse, killing the matron, who was the essentially the superintendent's wife.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that was unprecedented, completely unprecedented, and terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And the Board of Health did go out of their way to pay tribute to Eve Kugler, who was the matron, who was in part responsible for cooking meals and providing supplies,
Mm-hmm.
basic supplies for, and cleaning the facility, the basic day-to-day operations. The Board of Health paid tribute to her services and to those of Fanny Gartrell, who was a longtime nurse and the head nurse there, um, and praised them for their dedication, loyalty, and hard work. Um, and the fact that they lost their lives during this outbreak is, one time, unfortunately, when the work of women becomes visible. But then there's another woman who comes on the scene in a surprising way. Um, when Eve Kugler, the matron, fell ill, a friend of hers from the city, named Mary Riddle, came to visit her and to help take care of her.
Hmm.
So, um, under normal circumstances, during an outbreak, nobody from the outside would be able to enter the Lazaretto, and no one from inside the Lazaretto would be able to
Mm-hmm.
leave. But in 1870, all hell broke loose, and essentially the the staff
Hmm.
were too terrified to show up for work, or simply fled
Sure.
entirely,
Yeah.
and discipline had broken down. It was just
Yeah.
chaos. And at the Lazaretto itself, and Mary Riddle, who had she was a widow, had been married to the former mayor of Pittsburgh. Um, she came down from Philadelphia to visit her friend, and she saw the chaos around her, and she said, "All right, this has to stop." And Mary Riddle, this outsider, took charge of everything at the Lazaretto. She cooked, she cleaned, she cared for patients, she rounded up additional volunteers and put those members of the staff who she was able to coax back into work to back in on their jobs, and somehow word of this uh, got to a journalist who published a tribute to Mary Riddle a few days later in one of the Philadelphia papers. And And for me, it's not necessarily those three individuals whose work was especially
Yeah.
important, although it's noteworthy. Um, but it just points to the fact that the work of caregiving and of cleaning and feeding is absolutely essential. Often, I would argue, the difference between life and
Hmm.
death, and is mostly unappreciated and invisible, and often done by women.
Yep.
And I think the disaster of 1870 just should remind us to not lose sight of that kind of work and that kind of
Yeah.
caregiving in our world.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen. So you're the end of the book. I mean, I think the whole thing, like you point out that the controversy and that quarantine being a political minefield, as you say, it never goes away. Really, it continues on. But what finally led to the Lazaretto's closing in 1895?
Yeah. Oh, it's like it's like watching a horrible car accident happen in slow motion. And yeah, in my book, I spend a bit of time examining the work of um, Dr. W.T. Robinson, who was, in a sense, the hero of my book
Mm-hmm.
because he's a physician and a quarantine. He was Lazaretto physician in the late 1870s and early 1880s. And he was also an amateur historian who began writing a history. He began essentially writing my book in around 1880 using the Board of Health
Oh, cool.
archives,
Yeah.
the same Board of Health archives that I
Uh
used.
huh.
He never was able to finish it, but he serialized it in the newspaper he ran. He was a newspaper publisher
Hmm.
and physician and Lazaretto physician
Hmm.
for 5 years. Um, he just was an unusually skillful physician and political operator.
Mm-hmm.
All Lazaretto physicians were political appointees. They owed their position to their political loyalty to the party of the governor
Mm-hmm.
because they were appointed by the governor. Um, and Robinson was no different. But um, he was a skillful physician who actually treated really desperate cases of yellow fever successfully. I don't think he lost. Oh, I think he did lose one patient to yellow fever of all the ones he treated
Hmm.
during his time at the Lazaretto. But in addition to that, he understood the political stakes of his job better than anyone else. He negotiated these very difficult situations with determination, resolve, and political savvy um, in a way that no other Board of Health member or Lazaretto physician had done in the history of the institution. So it's, I thought it was worth, and certainly a lesson for public health officials
Yeah.
today in how to handle how to handle the politics of public health. And public health always has been, is now, and always will be fundamentally political. It's
Yeah.
about the distribution of resources in society, public health policies of political effects and consequences. Anyway, Robinson understood all that better than anyone. He knew how to listen to people who were not happy with his policies. He knew how to make them feel heard.
Yeah.
He knew how to relax the rules when it was safe enough to do so, and he knew when to absolutely not relax the rules at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but after Robinson's time, there was a succession of Lazaretto physicians who were either incompetent, um, impossible to get along with, or some combination of both of those traits. And what what happened was um, a series of um, increasingly vicious uh, disagreements and accusations flying back and forth between the Board of Health and the Lazaretto, a series of Lazaretto physicians in the late 1880s and early 1890s, and it's just um, it's just painful to watch because it's just a combination of um, you know sort of political tone deafness
Mm-hmm.
and um, thin-skinned um, thin-skinned men um, like feeling their honor being
Yeah.
impugned and lashing out. It's just sort of
Yeah.
the worst qualities of white men,
Yeah.
on display. Um, and um, yeah, it also provides a lesson for politicians and public health officials today in how not to respond to
Yeah.
threats of disease. And so there was a threat of cholera a couple of times, um, and um, just a just a really, like I said, slow motion car wreck
Mm-hmm.
of animosity between the Board of Health and the a series of Lazaretto physicians, and the Lazaretto itself did not survive
Mm-hmm.
these episodes, and essentially there were real estate interests in Delaware County, where the Lazaretto is located, just outside Philadelphia, that saw an opportunity for to make money on land near this quarantine station. The problem was no one wanted to live in the neighborhood of a
Yeah.
pest house, as they called it, particularly remembering what had happened in 1870
Mm-hmm.
when yellow fever had spread beyond the Lazaretto's boundaries. So it took a couple of tries, but the Delaware County real estate interests succeeded in passing legislation in the state capital in Harrisburg to shut down the Lazaretto, which finally happened after the quarantine season of
Hmm.
1895. And the site had a couple of interesting afterlives after that, as a essentially a kind of country club, and
Uh-huh.
then a seaplane base and flight school.
Okay.
Um, uh, but its years as a quarantine station ended in
And
1895, just around the time that Ellis Island and Angel Island and the well-known sort of federally
yeah.
operated immigration stations were being built.
Amongst other hats in the world, you're the vice president of the Lazaretto Preservation Association. So, I mean, what's there now at the site?
Yeah, it because of these strange afterlives, um, unlike most quarantine stations, which were demolished or fell into disrepair over the years. Um, the Lazaretto was not demolished and did not fall into
Mm-hmm.
disrepair. It survived as a physical site. A couple of the buildings have been lost over the
Mm-hmm.
decades, but the main building survives, and four of the smaller outbuildings survive
That's so
today.
cool.
And coincidentally, just at the time that I discovered this place and the physical site began to grab hold of me and refuse to let go, um, the site itself was the object of a preservation battle in the seaplane base and marina and flight school that had operated there from 1915 to 2000 finally shut down when the family who ran it, retired and closed, ceased operations there. And at that point, the property was sold to a developer who wanted to demolish everything and build an airport parking facility because it's right next door to
Yeah,
Philadelphia
sure.
International Airport.
Yeah.
Um, that did not happen, thankfully, in part because Tinicum Township, which is the municipality in which the Lazaretto is located, managed to, with help from the state legislature, buy the property and save the buildings. And the initial plan was to build a new fire station for the township and banquet hall and parking lot on the unbuilt portion
Hmm.
of the Lazaretto site. Um, that created its own preservation battle when local preservation organizations fought against this proposal on the theory that it would, while it wouldn't demolish any of the existing buildings, it would, um, it would ruin the historical integrity of the site. Um, General practice in preservation is when you have a historic site that has survived, you don't build anything new on it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there was a lawsuit. It was nasty. Fast forward a few months, and the lawsuit was settled, um, and the provisions of the settlement were that the township was allowed to go ahead and build a fire station, parking lot, and banquet facility, and the remainder of the property would be preserved under the authority of a nonprofit group called the Lazaretto Preservation Association of Tinicum Township. And that group would consist of representatives from the township and representatives from preservation organizations. Um, and that's the board that I sit on today. And it's been a real education. I don't know about you, but I didn't study historic
No.
preservation or public history in graduate school at all. It was the last thing I thought I would be involved in. But lo and behold, it's a rich and fascinating field, also politically controversial.
Sure.
Um, and it's been a real education for me. And the main building of the Lazaretto was recently restored at great cost. And uh, I encourage everyone who listens to this podcast to visit it. We're in the process of developing a set of exhibits. Right now, there's an audio tour. There's actually two different audio
Oh,
tours that
cool.
visitors can take on their smartphones. It's available at lazaretto.site. And we have all kinds of events planned. There's going to be a book launch party there for on May 21st for to celebrate this book's birth, and more events planned for the future and exhibits there on site. So it's um, it's an ongoing adventure. I never thought I'd be involved in something like this, but I'm completely hooked, for better or for worse.
Well, that's wonderful, David. I can't. I really want to emphasize to listeners that this is a beautifully written book. I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. It's been great.
It's my pleasure, Lee, and yeah, it's been a fun conversation.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.